I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS, where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm Alex Kissling, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reich, the CSIS Trade Guys. Thanks for listening to The Trade Guys. On today's episode, we examine the trade and economic impacts of the war in Iran. Then, Bill and Scott take a look at the recent decision from the Court of International Trade on tariff refunds and the ongoing trade dispute between Colombia and Ecuador. All that and more on today's Trade Guys. Bill and Scott, we're going to focus today on the implications of the conflict in Iran as it enters its second week and the economic effects start to play out. There are many dimensions to this war and events are moving quickly, but several developments are particularly important for us to unpack. So let's start with the Strait of Hormuz, if we can, in the situation there and the ripple effects we're already seeing across global oil and gas markets. Bill, can you give us a sense of the current state of play in the Strait of Hormuz and what you're watching most closely right now?
Yeah, well, let me take one step back a bit. I think there's a long-term issue and a short-term issue with these. The short term, every time Trump does something like this, there's a market spasm, it tanks. But usually, the market has figured this out and it usually comes back. At the time we're recording this, which is March 5th in the afternoon, the Dow was down last time I looked around 850, which is actually coming back. It was down earlier in the day at more than 1100. It'll be back to some sort of equilibrium. There's a few people who think we're heading into a bear market. I leave that to the professional forecasters to talk about that. Clearly, oil and gas prices are up. Crude is up at around $85 a barrel, which is a fairly significant increase. LNG prices are up. This is all short term. If this conflict is over soon, it'll be a blip. It won't make a lot of difference.
It's a big if.
The real issue is exactly where you began, Alex, which is the Strait of Hormuz, because interdicting the traffic there means that refineries are closing, LNG production plants are going to close in the Gulf, and nothing's going to get out. And if that, again, is a matter of 2 or 3 days, nobody cares except the shipping companies and clearing out the backlog. There's more than 200 ships right now that are stranded. Not all of them carrying oil and gas, but that's a lot of ships stuck in the Gulf. If this disruption goes away, equilibrium gets restored. But if it doesn't and carries on, then there's going to be a really significant effect on the trading system and on the global economy, including us. You might think that we're exempt because we are net oil exporter, but this is going to affect American supply chains if it continues on. The big losers in the short run will be primarily in Asia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, India, some countries in Southeast Asia who are heavily dependent on oil from Gulf states and Gulf producers. And all of a sudden, they're going to have immediate supply problems. If this continues at some length, that's going to affect factories in those countries. That's going to affect supply chains. It's going to affect their exports and American imports and ultimately manufacturing production in the United States. China, ironically, is not home free, but more home free because they have pipelines from Russia and Kazakhstan that can supply them over land. And so they're not as vulnerable as everybody else, although they are a sizable importer and they'll have to scramble to make adjustments. Europeans don't buy a lot of oil these days from the Gulf, but they're going to be affected by spikes in gas prices and LNG prices, in part not because they buy so much from the region, but because they buy a lot on the spot market. And the spot market is highly responsive to global political events like the one we're talking about. So prices go up, Europeans pay more. That creates an interesting opportunity for the United States because it could divert some supplies to the spot market and help the Europeans out. And since the price is going up, they'd make a decent amount of money for themselves. So this is not all bad for the U.S., although net, I think it's going to be a net negative. There has been some discussion about can the U.S. fill the oil gap as well, because we are a net exporter. The 50,000 meter answer is not really, because we're pretty much at production max. We can tweak, we can play some games and produce some more stuff, but I don't think that we can fill a fifth of the world's oil demand, which is really what's at stake here. So long term, this is going to be an issue. The other issue that's come up that Trump is attempting to deal with the problem by providing both military escorts, which to the ships, which they haven't done yet, but we'll see if that works. I mean, there are logistical issues there, but also insurance, because the private insurance companies are bailing fast on this kind of thing. And anybody in the maritime business wants to make sure their cargoes are insured. Trump has tasked the Development Finance Corporation of the United States with figuring this out. We have a former CSIS colleague who used to work there. So I chatted with her about this, and she did a little research and thinks that, yes, they probably can do it. The statute permits them to provide political risk insurance. You could probably say that what Trump wants to do falls into that category. There are hoops and hurdles. There has to be some analysis done. There would have to be findings made. So this is not something that can happen tomorrow. It has to happen over a short period of time. The big issue has been that there are income restrictions on DFC insurance guarantees and loans. Mostly they're supposed to focus on low income and middle income countries. There is, thanks to some new legislation that was enacted late last year, the BUILD Act, amendments to the BUILD Act, they've got a little more flexibility now to use waiver authority to deal with high income countries. So it would depend on, who's being insured. And, you could look at what flag the vessel is flying under, because a lot of these ships fly under flags of convenience, like Liberia or Panama, which are not high income countries. So if you do it that way, it's easier. If you do it by where the tanker's parent ownership company is based, that, you might be able to do it that way. I think the short answer is that there are ways to do this via the DFC, whether there'll be any takers or not. I mean, because there's still risk. Whether anybody will want to do that, I think, remains to be seen. I suspect right now, everybody's hoping this is going to get over with by the end of the week and everything will be fine. My guess is that's not going to happen.
Right.
It's a little bit like the Ukraine war. Whoever runs out of ammunition first loses. And both parties seem to be pursuing, a strategy that's designed to get the other side to run out first. That's not a pathway to a quick solution.
Yeah. Scott, I want to pull the insurance thread with you a little bit more, but I'm very curious for your overall view here on the economic and trade impacts of this conflict.
Well, sure. This always happens with oil because energy has essentially an absolutely flat demand in the short term, right? We are going to use energy one way or another. So the only thing that always happens is prices always spike to deal with the fact that the demand is basically fixed in the short term. So that shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. It will have a regional effect because, natural gas is really regional, but even crude oil and where it is refined and distributed is also has regional effects now. Bill failed to mention the big loser. The big loser here is Iran, right? And they not only have no air force and their navy, their warships are now submarines and the command structure is dead, and they lose a missile launcher every time they launch a missile. They now have no source of funds to replenish it because there are no oil exports. So from a combat tactics standpoint, mazel tov. That's actually pretty good. I've noticed that, and Bill did mention that there's a substantial spread between West Texas Intermediate, which is the key U.S. benchmark, and Brent crude, which is the North Sea. So it's a European benchmark. It's over $10 a barrel.
Is that right?
That gives you an idea of the stress on the system. And so the United States will feel this in its domestic economy on a much less than the rest of the world, because almost all of our energy that we consume on a daily basis is produced and refined in North America. So it's really separate from the area of conflict now. And most of what goes through the Persian Gulf, certainly Iranian oil, but lots of oil from the Middle East now winds up in Asia. So Asia will have the biggest effects, which is basically what Bill outlined.
Gasoline is up 20 cents a gallon over the week. It may come back down.
Yeah, that'll happen. That's part of the lack of flexibility in the demand curve in the short term. People will take action. There was a Bloomberg note about diesel in China. Apparently, it's on allocation. So it's worse elsewhere. 20 cents a gallon may or may not come down soon is what you get from the uncertainty. So I do think Bill's got that part right. I think the insurance, certainly Lloyd's is out of the business. And many of the container vessels, their ownership is saying, we're not moving anything. Costco was the most recent announcement I saw, who is the largest container shipper in the world. And so we'll see what happens as this unfolds. But I do think that insurance, if it can be provided and underwritten properly. So for me, getting a development agency in the United States that isn't in that business into it, Bill outlined the potential statutory problems with that. But for me, it's an expertise question. Can you get somebody who can credibly underwrite marine insurance for an organization that's never issued a policy? So that could take some time as well. Once again, we'll see how this plays out.
There has to be some level of security, regardless of the insurance, though, right? I mean, it's shipping companies are not going to put crews and infrastructure through, terribly dangerous.
That's clear. It really depends how long this conflict is kinetic, essentially. And we'll see. It started a long time ago and started in 1979, and it's been at a very sort of low-grade level. And the two decisive actions, first the bombing of the nuclear facilities, and now this action, are quite different dynamically, and we'll see how long they last.
It's a little bit of a different case than what we were doing with the Red Sea.
Yes, definitely.
In the earlier phrase, because in that case, there's another route.
Yes.
I mean, it's more expensive. It takes a lot longer. It's not desirable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a path.
You could avoid the Suez. Yeah.
Yeah. The Strait of Hormuz, there's only one way out.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes right past Iran. It's not that wide. And so it really is a point of vulnerability. Now, if you can knock out, all of their attack capabilities along the shore there, or within whatever range you need to have, maybe you can reduce the risk. But right now, I think Scott's exactly right. Companies they're not all going to take a chance on this.
No.
You got a cargo full of oil, you're not going to risk having it get blown up with all the environmental consequences and the lawsuits that will inevitably follow.
Sure.
True.
Seems logical. Scott, I want to dig in a little deeper on something Bill touched upon here. But if you're, a major American trading partner, who's the most nervous right now about this becoming a prolonged conflict in terms of the economic impact? Is it indeed Asian nations, or is it global in nature?
Well, I think Asia is the most immediate importer, most of these products, and products exported from other markets are basically spoken for. People's production networks have been created to take on certain kinds of oil. So oil is not all the same thing. And obviously it has its own internal supply chains in order to get to a refined product and get to the market. But it looks to me like Asia will have the most to deal with in the near term. There is additional capacity if you can reach the point of safe transit. The additional capacity is mostly Middle Eastern. It is in places like Saudi Arabia,
right,
and some of our Gulf partners where there is more opportunity to ramp up production. So we'll see. The world has lived pretty effectively. And I mean, life went on at $70 to $90 a barrel of oil, which we had for 5 or 6 years. And most recently, it's been in the low 60s. And so we know how to operate, and most companies know how to operate at both levels and manage the risk of the in-between. So I don't think it's been dramatic yet, the extent of the change. But once again, all bets are off if this is prolonged, or if other parties enter the conflict. So nobody knows.
I think the long-term problem, if this continues, the long-term problem for the United States is, there will be some price inflation because of even the West Texas crude that follows, global price trends. But it looks like they're stabilizing. And they're stabilizing at a level, as Scott said, that is manageable compared to the $135 that it was back in the previous crisis. I think the real problem is going to come up with increased either disruptions in supply chains or increased cost of production in supply chains from Asia, and not primarily China, but other countries, because Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Taiwan, they're going to be heavily impacted. Either if they can't get the oil, or if they can at a higher price, that's going to affect their manufacturing facilities. It's going to affect their utilities. It's going to affect their prices. And so this is not soon.
Right.
But down the line, the long-term impact is Americans are going to pay more for stuff that comes in overseas, or they're going to have supply chain interruptions because factories in Taiwan, for example, which is 96% dependent on oil from the region, they're going to shut down, and that's going to create interruptions that are going to cause problems. That's why, I think there's a lot of pressure to, at least from the business community, to settle this one way or the other quickly so they can restore the status quo ante or some semblance of it, or at least getting the product moving.
Right.
People can cope with higher prices. It's a lot harder to cope with zero supply.
Yes, that's true. But you're right, Bill. Most of the economies, other than the United States, that are large industrial economies, are major importers of hydrocarbons. The United States has a plentiful supply domestically, and it's a very strong competitive advantage at the moment. We have sort of energy abundance in North America, and the rest of the industrial world tends to be importers.
So do you think this leads to more reshoring of manufacturing? So make Trump happy?
Well, I don't know that I would not make those decisions right at the moment. I would just say there is a distinctive difference in the United States and our current strategy of energy dominance, which is, you listen to Chris Wright's speeches, that's the way he characterizes it. So the energy secretary. So it sets us in a different set of issues than the rest of the world.
Well, guys, the landscape is shifting rapidly, and I'm sure the conversation will certainly shift a bit by the next time we gather and talk. So we'll be tracking this. I'm going to, as I like to do, give a shameless plug here for all of our listeners to please visit csis.org. We have just a great roster of experts who's been putting out extraordinary analysis throughout the past week. A ton of podcast episodes, written analysis, data analysis, events. So please stay tuned. We have a lot more planned as events unfold here in the coming days and weeks. I do want to touch upon two other topics before we break today. And Bill, I want to go back to you and just ask for an update. We had a decision from the Court of International Trade on tariffs just a few days ago. What happened there?
Yeah, very quickly, it was a little bit surprising and interesting. This is the question of refunds, which case law and precedent suggests are now due for all the tariffs that the Supreme Court declared illegal with interest. And the administration seems now to be saying that, yes, they acknowledge that they need to pay the money back, and they need to pay it back with interest. Everybody has been waiting for the Court of International Trade, to which this case is being sent back, to set up rules for that. And people were expecting some delay there because under the Supreme Court's rules, these decisions they make are not final for 25 days to give the losers an opportunity to appeal. Basically asked for a reconsideration, which is very rarely granted. I think I read the last time they granted one of those was 1956. So you can see it doesn't happen very often. Trump indicated that he would like to have that happen. So whether they filed for that or not, I don't know. But in the interim, there have been now, I think, more than 2,000 lawsuits filed, most of them prior to the Supreme Court decision, in anticipation of the decision, with companies wanting their money back. So they're all pending at the Court of International Trade. And one of the judges, Judge Eaton, announced that pick out one of these and issued an order. And he said in passing that all these cases have been assigned to him. And he implied that they're all going to have the same decision, which will simplify things a little bit. And what his decision was that it's a little complicated because it has to deal with a distinction between liquidated entries and unliquidated entries. But basically, he instructed the customs for unliquidated entries, which means those that have not been settled, to subtract the IEEPA tariff, refunded if it's been paid with interest, and then liquidate the entries at the lower rate. And I think he further prescribed for liquidated entries, I think they're going to have to go back and reliquidate, again, with a refund. And basically what he's done is issue an order that he is going to apply to everybody, all importers. Now, the administration is going to appeal. They've been trying to slow roll this, as I think we predicted. And what they first said was, we need a delay of like 4 months to set everything up and get everything ready. And basically the judge rejected that and said, you need to start right away and get moving. That's being appealed, so it won't start right away. So those of you that are, planning to go out for dinner on the refund, don't. It's still what we said last week. The money's not coming, but this is an early indication.
You give us the green light to go out to dinner when you can, Bill. We're all waiting.
Well, I'll give everybody the green light, and I'll be the first one at the restaurant. But the indication here is the court's not going to mess around. And they remember what the administration committed on this to refund the money. And Trump may have forgotten that, but the court clearly has not.
Scott, anything on this for you?
Well, I just hope all the economists who so meticulously track the price rises and the components of inflation that were caused by the tariffs are just as careful in tracking whether those final prices actually reflect a lower consumer pricing as refunds get made. My own understanding, be it mostly practical, of pricing is it's pretty murky. Prices are pretty sticky in both directions, and we're going to have a hard time finding it at the end of the day. But I think the court's doing the right thing in terms of making the implementation speedy and giving those who basically were on the winning side of the case an opportunity to collect quickly and get back to business.
All right. Well, Scott, I want to stick with you for our last topic of today, and I want to get your perspective on the trade dispute playing out between Ecuador and Colombia, where we have a left-wing president in Colombia pitted against a right-wing leader in Ecuador. Scott, what's going on here, and is this really a policy dispute or an ideological proxy battle?
It doesn't matter. This sort of thing actually happens all the time. And I only know this because I spent most of the George W. Bush administration working on free trade agreements in Latin America. We had a number of them. It was great work. The president's philosophy was trade, not aid. And he put a lot of political capital into making it happen. But starting with the NAFTA, which of course included Mexico, there were Chile, the Andean countries got together and then fell apart, but Peru and Colombia finished up, Panama, the DR, CAFTA. So there was a lot of excellent work. And what I noted during those years is, while there are many statements and aspirations about pan-American ideals among our Latin American neighbors, there are in fact a lot of tensions with their actual physical neighbors. So it's not at all uncommon to find commercial disputes, to find territorial disputes. I believe there was a land dispute between Peru and Chile, which came up during the U.S.-Peru free trade agreement talks, as well as who really grew pisco for pisco sours. So those kinds of disputes go on all the time. This is one where I read about it and said, well, yes, you do have left versus right in the parties of the leaders. But it also strikes me that everybody wants to be Tariff Man. I couldn't help but hearing that 80s song from Huey Lewis and the News, "It's hip to be square." All of a sudden, everybody wants to put tariffs on things. So we've got that. But this is kind of part of living in the region and not particularly messy or harmful to human life at the moment. So I think we should let them work it out, as all these things wind up doing eventually.
It's reassuring. Bill, anything on this?
Not a lot. It just seems to me that we may be heading down the road of more and more of these because they're inspired by Trump. These are 50% tariffs, 35% tariffs. They're slapping on each other. They're doing Trumpian things. And as Scott has said, this is not the first time this has happened, and particularly with those countries. In fact, there was a war fought in the past, I think actually between Chile and Bolivia, over where to draw the borders a long time ago. But Trump has given other countries permission to do this. He has torpedoed the rules in the international economic system. And as I said, it's not the first time Pakistan and India have done this to each other. It will continue to happen, as Scott said. I just think now that sadly, the gloves are kind of off, and people are feeling free to ignore WTO limitations and rules, whereas before they would at least think twice before they ignored them. And now they only think once. And that's too bad. It's going to take us a while, if ever, to get back to the system where the rules were respected.
Bill and Scott, we're going to leave it there for today. Thank you, as always, for your insights. Again, we'll continue to monitor events out of the Middle East, and we'll provide updates on future episodes. And we thank our audience for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Thanks.
You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast. For more audio content, visit csis.org/podcasts. Thanks for tuning in.